To Washington, where the Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, is speaking.
The distinguished chair of the Judiciary Committee, Chairman Nadler.
Thank you. The framers reserved the power of impeachment for the gravest offenses against our Constitution, against our liberty, and against our democratic institutions. President Trump used the powers of his office for his own personal political gain, to the detriment of the national security interests of the United States. That is the very definition of an impeachable offense. When Congress began to investigate President Trump's wrongdoing, he engaged in an unprecedented pattern of obstruction. That, too, is why the impeachment power exists. A president who subverts both our elections and our constitutional system of checks and balances puts himself above the law. And it is Congress' duty to hold the president, any president, accountable. It gives us no pleasure to stand here today.
All right, folks, welcome to Dr. John Podcast. Once again, across all 50 states, the largest sustained citizen mobilization in modern U.S. history is answering the founders' question, who rules here? With a resounding rejection of the president's authority. The movement has grown from scattered gatherings into a nationwide force that has the White House in a state of barely concealed panic. The phenomenon that has gripped the nation began quietly enough, with small groups of citizens gathering in public spaces to express their dismay at policies that were affecting their daily lives. But something unexpected happened. These gatherings didn't fade away like typical protest movements. They multiplied. They organized. They became a recurring presence that the political class could not ignore. And the more the White House escalated its confrontational approach, the more the crowds grew.
But President Trump's conduct has put our next election at risk. President Trump's behavior puts the integrity of our constitutional order at risk. And President Trump's continued actions put the rule of law at risk. The framers gave us the power of impeachment for exactly this reason, and in fulfillment of our oath and obligation to the American people, today we took action to hold President Trump accountable for the serious and undisputed risk he poses to our free and fair elections and to the separation of powers that safeguards our liberty. A president must not be allowed to become a dictator. I want to thank Speaker Pelosi, Chairman Schiff, my fellow investigative chairs, and all of my colleagues who today defended the principles upon which our nation was established. Today, the House of Representatives did its constitutional duty. Today, we lived up to our responsibility to the American people by taking action to defend our national security, to preserve our democratic elections, and to show that no one, not even the president, is above the law. I'm now happy to introduce the chairman of the Intelligence Committee, Adam Schiff.
It is as if the administration's every attempt to project strength and dominance has been transformed into recruiting material for the opposition, a feedback loop that has trapped the president in a cycle he cannot seem to break. Each new controversial action, each deployment of federal forces, each threatening statement has been followed by a larger outpouring of citizen opposition, as if the country has discovered a new immune response to what it perceives as authoritarian overreach. The scale of this mobilization demands a serious examination because the numbers tell a story that cannot be dismissed as media hype or partisan exaggeration. In one of the earliest major waves of opposition, demonstrations materialized in roughly 1,200 locations across every state in the Union, a logistical achievement that required months of organizing and thousands of volunteer hours.
The President of the United States has been impeached for now only the third time in history. The President of the United States should be tried. And the question is now whether Senator McConnell will allow a fair trial in the Senate, whether the majority leader will allow a trial that involves witnesses and testimony and documents, a trial that should be fair to the President, yes, but should be fair also to the American people. The American people want to hear from people like John Bolton. The American people want to hear from people like Mick Mulvaney. The American people want to see what's in those documents that the President has been hiding at the State Department, in the Office of Management and Budget, in the White House itself. We have done our duty here in the House. We have upheld the Constitution. We have done as the framers would have us do when a president abuses his office and obstructs a co-equal branch of government. The question now is, will the Senate uphold its duty?
The grievances were concrete and deeply personal. There were mass deportations tearing families apart. There were federal agency closures that removed essential services from communities. There were Social Security offices shuttered, leaving elderly citizens without the support they had spent their working lives earning. There were tariffs that drove up prices on everyday goods and threatened jobs in manufacturing communities. This was not abstract political theory. This was the daily reality of American families being disrupted by policies that seemed designed to reward the powerful at the expense of everyone else. The movement's infrastructure matured rapidly as organizers learned from each wave, developing systems that could reactivate on short notice and scale to unprecedented size. What had begun as local responses to specific grievances evolved into a distributed network of community organizers who knew each other, who shared resources, who could turn out crowds with remarkable speed.
Will the senators uphold their oath? Do the senators want to hear from the witnesses? Do they want a real trial? We have to hope that they do. The reason we undertook this extraordinary step is because the president not only abused his office, but threatens to abuse it again, threatens to interfere again by inviting foreign interference in our election. The remedy isn't complete as long as the president is free to continue to invite foreign interference in our affairs. I just want to close by thanking the Speaker for guiding the Congress through this tumultuous time. There's no one, I think, who could have guided the Congress with a steadier hand or with more insight and intellect than the Speaker of the House. And I also want to thank my colleagues, in particular, so many new members of the House who have displayed such courage, who have shown that they truly have the courage of their convictions. Thank you.
This organizational capacity was tested and proven repeatedly as the waves kept coming, each one larger than the last, each one better organized, each one more strategically focused. The 50 protests in 50 states on a single day became a template that demonstrated the movement's reach and its ability to coordinate across vast geographical distances and political divides. 1,600 sites became 3,200, and each increase represented countless hours of volunteer organizing, countless conversations in community centers, countless decisions by ordinary citizens to put themselves in public view and declare their opposition. The strategic evolution of the movement is visible in the branding that emerged as the waves continued. What began as protests against specific policies.
Just want to add that one person who isn't with us physically in this room, but I know was present all day for the deliberations, our chair of the Gov Reform, our Oversight Committee chair, our North Star, Elijah Cummings. He said, when the history books are written about this tumultuous era, I want them to show that I was among those in the House of Representatives who stood up to lawlessness and tyranny. He also said, somewhat presciently, when we're dancing with the angels, the question will be, what did you do to make sure we kept our democracy intact? We did all we could, Elijah. We passed the 2 articles of impeachment. The president is impeached. You mean more fair trial than they're contemplating? Because we had a very fair process in the House of Representatives. I would yield to our, let me just put it another way. We have legislation approved by the Rules Committee that will enable us
matured into a broader critique of presidential power itself, a framing that connected the scattered grievances into a coherent narrative about the direction of American governance. The organizers chose words deliberately, invoking the revolutionary vocabulary that had animated the nation's founding centuries earlier. The decision to use a particular phrase was not accidental, but a calculated move to place the current conflict in the context of America's long struggle against concentrated power. The timing was equally deliberate, aligned with the anniversary of the revolution that had created the nation, a reminder that the country had faced similar questions before and had chosen liberty over submission. This historical resonance gave the movement a moral authority that purely policy-based protests often lack, connecting the current moment to the fundamental principles that define the nation. The split-screen images that have defined this era capture the essence of what is happening with devastating clarity. On one side, the pageantry of power, the parades, the military displays, the celebration of the presidency as a quasi-monarchical institution. On the other, the people standing in the same cities, sometimes just blocks away, chanting their answer to the spectacle. In Washington, in the same hour that the president addressed a military festival celebrating the Army's anniversary, crowds outside were chanting the accusation that has become the movement's rallying cry. The BBC captured the moment, broadcasting the split image to the world, the celebration and the opposition simultaneously, a visual representation of a nation divided against itself. The president's attempt to fuse his own persona with the nation's birthday became the movement's most powerful propaganda tool, as every display of royal imagery was met with signs demanding the exact opposite. The international dimensions of this mobilization add another layer of significance to the story. When crowds gather in London and Paris under the same banners, carrying the same messages as Americans in their own cities, something remarkable is happening. The people of allied nations are registering their judgment on American governance, participating in a global conversation about the direction of American democracy. This international solidarity is not merely symbolic, but has concrete implications for how foreign governments assess American stability and reliability. When European allies see their own citizens demonstrating concern about American policy, it affects diplomatic calculations, trade decisions, and security arrangements. The images transmitted around the world of mass opposition in the United States undercut the administration's efforts to project an image of restored strength and unity. The polling data that parallels the protest waves provides independent verification of the movement's significance. During the earlier waves of opposition, the president's approval rating fell to levels that would have been considered catastrophic for any other modern president. The internal numbers were even more troubling, with the public expressing deep dissatisfaction on the specific issues that the protests had identified as their grievances. The economy, the cost of living, the handling of international conflicts, all of these measures showed the public turning against the administration in numbers that could not be explained away by partisan division or media bias. The protesters were not a fringe minority, but a visible expression of sentiments that were shared by a majority of the country. The streets and the surveys were telling the same story in different languages, a convergence that gave the movement political force that pure protest could never achieve on its own. The response of the administration to the protests has been revealing and ultimately self-defeating. Each escalation, each threat, each deployment of federal forces has been followed by a larger outpouring of opposition. When the president threatened to meet protesters with overwhelming force, the crowds grew. When federal officers appeared in American cities, the numbers increased. When the administration sought to intimidate opposition, it inadvertently provided the movement with its most compelling recruiting material. The protesters understood something that the administration apparently did not. The attempt to suppress opposition only proves the necessity of opposition. Every heavy-handed response validated the movement's framing and converted skeptics into participants. This dynamic is the movement's greatest strength and the administration's greatest vulnerability, a tactical trap that the president seems constitutionally incapable of avoiding. The economic dimension of the movement extends beyond the issues that initially sparked the protests. The fusion of state power with private corporate interests that the movement identified early has become an increasingly central focus of the demonstrations. The relationship between the wealthiest individuals and the apparatus of government, the deployment of public resources for private benefit, the gutting of public services by those who profit from their privatization, all of these themes have emerged as unifying threads in the protest narrative. This economic critique gives the movement a breadth that purely political opposition often lacks, connecting the grievances of workers with the grievances of consumers, the fears of federal employees with the anxieties of small business owners. The protest sites have expanded from government buildings to corporate facilities, demonstrating a strategic sophistication that has kept the movement relevant even as specific issues have evolved. The logistics of sustaining a movement of this scale over this duration represent one of the most underappreciated aspects of the story. Every wave requires coordination across 50 states, communication among thousands of organizers, transportation of participants, materials for signs, and media coverage to amplify the message. The fact that the movement has maintained this capacity for years is extraordinary, suggesting that it has developed institutional depth that goes far beyond temporary outrage. The local hubs that have been established in communities across the country represent permanent infrastructure for political action, networks that can be reactivated for elections, for advocacy, for any future purpose. This infrastructure is the movement's legacy regardless of what happens next. A trained citizenry that knows how to organize, how to persuade, how to make its voice heard. The relationship between the protests and the broader political system is complex and mediated by multiple channels. The movement's direct impact on policy has been limited, as the administration has shown little willingness to respond to public pressure. But the indirect effects have been substantial, influencing how other actors in the political system calculate their own positions. Republican politicians in swing districts who see crowds in their hometowns adjust their calculations about how closely they want to align with the president. Judges who are issuing rulings that challenge the administration read the public mood that gives their decisions weight. Military leaders who value their relationship with the American people see the signs and the numbers and factor them into their professional judgments. The protests are a signal amplifier for every other check on presidential power, making each institutional actor more aware of the political consequences of their choices. The demographic composition of the protesters has been noted by observers, reflecting a cross-section of American society rather than a narrow partisan base. Families with children, retired veterans, small business owners, federal employees, students, and workers of every description have appeared in the crowds. This diversity undermines the administration's efforts to portray the movement as a fringe phenomenon driven by professional activists or outside agitators. The protesters are the American people in their full complexity, representing every region, every income level, every background. The images from the protests show the faces of a nation that is not easily categorized or dismissed, a fact that has made the movement difficult to counter through the usual political tactics of polarization or marginalization. The technological dimension of the mobilization has been crucial to its success, with social media platforms providing tools for organization, coordination, and amplification. The ability to share information rapidly across vast distances has enabled the movement to respond quickly to events and to build momentum without traditional organizational structures. The use of digital tools has also allowed the movement to document its own activities, creating a record that cannot be disputed or erased. The images, the videos, the first-hand accounts that have flowed from the protests provide evidence that the movement exists at the scale that organizers claim, that the crowds are real, that the opposition is genuine. This documentary function is politically important because it prevents the administration from denying or minimizing the significance of what is happening. The historical comparisons that have been drawn to other eras of protest in American history are instructive but ultimately limited. The Vietnam War protests, the civil rights demonstrations, the Occupy movement, the Women's March, all of these provide partial parallels to the current situation, but none of them combined the frequency, geography, and sustained duration of the current mobilization. The ability to maintain this level of activism over years across all 50 states through multiple waves and multiple issues is unprecedented. The movement has achieved a permanence that previous protest waves lacked, becoming a recurring feature of American political life rather than a temporary response to specific circumstances. This institutionalization represents a transformation of American civic culture that may persist long after the current political moment has passed. The legal framework surrounding the protests has been tested repeatedly, with questions emerging about the boundaries of First Amendment protections and the proper scope of government response to demonstrations. The administration's threats and deployments have raised constitutional questions that will likely be litigated for years. The tension between the right to assemble and the maintenance of public order is a perennial feature of American democracy, but it has taken on particular urgency in the current context given the scale and persistence of the opposition. The courts have been forced to adjudicate these questions, adding another layer to the institutional checks that are being tested by the current political crisis. The legal battles over protest rights may ultimately prove as significant as the protests themselves in defining the limits of presidential power. The response of local officials to the protests has been varied, reflecting the political diversity of the country. In some communities, mayors and governors have embraced the protests as legitimate expressions of democratic citizenship. In others, local authorities have been more confrontational, seeking to limit protest activities and restrict access to public spaces. This variation has created a patchwork of protest conditions across the country, with some communities experiencing robust civic engagement and others facing significant repression. The inconsistency of official responses has itself become an issue, with protesters in more restrictive jurisdictions pointing to the contrast with freer areas as evidence of the uneven application of constitutional protections. The economic consequences of the protests extend beyond the immediate disruption of public spaces. The consumer boycotts that have emerged in connection with the movement represent a significant innovation in protest tactics, targeting the economic interests of corporations associated with the administration's agenda. The ability to hit government through its corporate partners has proved to be a powerful tool, as market pressures cannot be ignored or dismissed in the way that purely political opposition sometimes can. The stock market valuations of target companies have reflected the impact of the boycotts, creating financial incentives for corporate leaders to distance themselves from the administration's most controversial policies. This economic dimension has added another channel of pressure to the movement's arsenal, making it more difficult for the administration to isolate its opposition as purely political. The international perception of the protests has been shaped by the global reach of American media and the attention that foreign audiences have paid to the domestic political drama. The images of mass opposition in the United States have been broadcast around the world, affecting how other nations view American democracy and American governance. The contrast between American rhetoric about democratic values and the reality of political crisis has not been lost on observers, feeding a narrative of American decline that has consequences for global influence and soft power. The protests have become part of the story that the world tells about the United States, a narrative that the administration has been unable to control or redirect. The timing of the protests relative to the electoral calendar is significant, with the midterm elections looming as the moment when the movement's organizing capacity must be converted into political outcomes. The infrastructure that has been built through years of protest organizing represents a powerful asset for voter mobilization, connecting citizens who have been activated by opposition to the institutional machinery of electoral politics. Whether this infrastructure will translate into electoral success is the central question of the current political moment, the test that will determine the movement's ultimate significance. The protests can create the conditions for political change, but elections are where change is made official. The specific grievances that animate the protests have evolved over time, incorporating new issues as the political context changes. What began as opposition to specific policies has become a broader critique of governance and a demand for democratic accountability. The flexibility of the movement's agenda has been one of its strengths, allowing it to absorb new issues without losing coherence or momentum. The protesters have shown a capacity to adapt to changing circumstances, to identify emerging threats, and to articulate new demands that reflect the current political reality. This adaptability suggests that the movement is not a passing phenomenon, but a durable feature of the political landscape. The relationship between the protests and the media has been complex and sometimes contentious. The administration has accused the media of amplifying opposition and attempting to delegitimize the presidency. The media has defended its coverage as appropriate reporting on significant political events. This tension is unlikely to be resolved, but it has had the effect of keeping the protests in the public eye and ensuring that the movement's grievances receive attention. The symbiotic relationship between the movement and the media has been essential to the protests' ability to maintain momentum, as coverage validates the protesters' sense of purpose and attracts additional participants. The mental health implications of sustained political conflict and protest should not be overlooked. The stress of living in a society that seems divided against itself, the fear of political violence, the anxiety about the future, all of these factors affect the well-being of citizens on both sides of the political divide. The protests themselves can be both a source of stress and a form of relief, providing an outlet for frustration and a sense of agency in the face of seemingly intractable problems. The psychological dimension of the political crisis is often ignored in analysis, but is essential to understanding why the movement has persisted and how it might end. The cultural significance of the protests extends beyond politics, touching on deep questions of national identity and purpose. The arguments about what America is and what it should be that are playing out in the streets reflect fundamental disagreements about the nation's values and direction. The protesters are not just opposing specific policies, but are asserting a vision of what the country should be, a vision that draws on the founding principles that have animated American history. The cultural struggle that is being waged in the protests is likely to outlast the current political moment, shaping the nation's sense of itself for generations. The role of the military in the protest era has been a particular concern, given the tensions between the administration and the armed forces that this series has documented. The use of military imagery in presidential pageantry, the deployment of troops in domestic contexts, and the public skepticism about the military's willingness to follow unlawful orders have all been raised in the context of the protests. The military's position as an independent institution committed to the Constitution rather than to any individual leader has been tested by the political crisis, and the institution's response has been carefully watched by all parties. The military's commitment to constitutional norms and its reluctance to be drawn into domestic political conflicts has been a stabilizing force in the chaos. The conclusion of this story is yet to be written, with the 2026 elections serving as the likely climax of the current political cycle. The protests have established that there is significant opposition to the administration's direction and that this opposition is capable of sustained mobilization. The question that remains is whether this opposition can be converted into enough votes to change the composition of Congress and thereby reshape the political environment. The midterm elections will be a test not just of the president's popularity, but of the protest movement's efficacy, the moment when the crowds either become ballots or fade into memory. One way or another, the American people will have the final word on the political drama that has consumed the nation, and that word will determine the future of American democracy. The sights and sounds of the protests are etched into the historical record, creating an archive that future generations will study to understand this extraordinary moment. The signs, the chants, the crowded streets, the sense of purpose and determination that pervades the gatherings, all of these are part of the story that will be told about the crisis of American democracy at the beginning of the 22nd century. The movement has left its mark on the country, not just in the changes it has produced, but in the evidence of citizen engagement that it has generated. Whatever happens next, the protests have demonstrated that when the American people believe their democracy is threatened, they will rise to defend it, and that is perhaps the most important lesson of all. The final image that will define this era is not the presidential pageantry or the official celebrations, but the split screen, the simultaneous representation of power and opposition, the monarchy and the people's answer. In the same city, in the same moment, the king's parade and the citizens' response. The image speaks volumes, capturing the central conflict of the age in a single frame. It will be the image that historians use to illustrate this moment, the photograph that communicates the story to posterity without the need for explanation. The people took to the streets to say what they believe, and their words will outlast the speeches and the ceremonies because they came from conviction rather than calculation, from the heart rather than the handler.